hello, and welcome back to another episode of our Growth Accelerator series. For anyone who is joining now or watching in the future, I am Marina. I'm the head of marketing here at Incendium. And every week we bring on different experts in different B2B industries related to growth, talking about all sorts of challenges and opportunities that B2B companies have to accelerate their growth. And today we have none other than Incendium's co-founder and CEO, Nate,
Hi, Marina.
here with us. Hi, Nate.
Happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween. We talked about dressing up. Neither of us did.
I should have sent you my vest, and you could have worn
That would
it
have been good. Yeah, I've never worn
Halloween.
a vest in my life.
They're available for purchase. I feel like we should add a link at the bottom of this stream.
Get a shop on our website because everyone's just dying to buy our merch.
The Incendium vest that Nate.
That'd be great. But Nate, we brought you on today because we're hearing from lots of folks, maybe not lots of folks, but whether or not people vocalize it, there are a lot of common misconceptions that we've noticed in the market about how and when to prioritize growth, particularly in the form of outbound, but really this could apply to any sort of marketing. And so I thought it'd be a good opportunity to just chat through some of those since they might be pertinent to viewers. So one of the main reasons that we most frequently hear, as you know, is that people shouldn't invest in marketing efforts because their product isn't ready yet.
Right.
And I guess, what are your thoughts?
I'm sensitive to this, right? I think so. So I think that that's the first thing to say is there's a lot of advice out there. Obviously, the most famous one, I think, being that if you're not embarrassed by your MVP, you waited too long, right? Which sounds really good in theory. I am sensitive or empathetic to the idea that that's really hard to do. It's socially difficult, I think. And then on the other hand, that's sort of one of many reasons that founding a startup is incredibly hard is you're in effect selling something before it should be sold, I think is part of the aim here. So yeah, I think where this comes up is people wondering whether they should do more work on the product itself before they start doing outbound. In our particular case, I think, as you mentioned, it could apply to any type of marketing, whatever you want it to be. I don't want to suggest, by the way, that the answer is always no, right? I think there are probably times where you gotta do something.
You need to build.
You need to build something or build a process even or whatever, hire somebody, whatever it is. But I do think that the point at which something is sellable to actually solve a problem is probably sooner than most people think. And even more importantly than that, it's often just a little bit of a nothing to fear but fear itself type thing too, where ultimately, if you just think about the long scale of the business that you want to build and how big you want it to be, there is no way that you're ever going to have everybody who ever interacts with your business or your product be happy. And so if you kind of start from a point where you're pitching a perfect game, there's a point where you're going to have churn. Some customers are going to not like what you have. There's a point where somebody's going to tell you that it doesn't work or it sucks. We have friends at a company called Quiller, those proposal software. They had a really hilarious anecdote where they had mean tweets. They had their CEO read mean product reviews, which was pretty hilarious. And they've been around for 10 years, but there's a degree of confidence in saying one, yes, we're going to mess up sometimes, right? And two, it's not for everybody. So all of this is a discussion, and maybe the most important thing we could try to do here is, are there ways to identify exactly when you should start doing some kind of marketing, or when are you ready to go to market? And the short answer to me is that you need to have something that can solve a problem for somebody. And that doesn't have to be a problem at the price point that you eventually want it to be. And it doesn't have to be tech. I think that the main thing that you want to do is understand if the mechanics of a value proposition hold up in a market. And I think there's some value early on in asking people, do the mechanics of my value proposition make sense to you? But especially when they're friendly, they're going to say yes.
Yeah.
And asking people to pay for it is really the only truest way to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think your point about price point is that was what was coming to mind for me too, is I think there's a little bit of a black and white mentality, right? Of here's the end goal and it's either ready for that or it's not. And, I'm going to feel bad or I'm going to be embarrassed if I'm asking people to pay a certain amount of money when the product isn't there yet. But to your point, pricing is on a scale, right? And pricing can shift over time.
Right. And there is this adage, like, it's harder to raise price. That's absolutely true. It's harder to raise prices on existing customers. You are going to have some customers who are way too cheap, but I think there's also an underestimation of like how many people are out there to sell to.
Right. And to your point, the data that you get, the data points that come from marketing your product when it is in those early stages, that is value in and of itself, even if it's not revenue generating directly. Mm-hmm. There's things you can do to build a better product over time that you can more easily attract new customers with. And you're going like in the right direction instead of a little off kilter to the side. And then all of a sudden you build something that no one really wants.
Yeah. And I don't think necessarily that we're breaking new ground with this. I do think that people understand this at an intuitive, as founders understand this at an intuitive level. And although I have had interesting discussions with people who are not in our space and it doesn't make any sense to them at all, which is fair. I guess maybe the point of this discussion is that even people who have been drilled in this so many times react differently when it's something that they built. And I think that understanding that bias in your own head is probably important. The other thing we probably should recognize is that there are dangers to this. There is too much of this. And I think a lot of startup fraud is actually the flip side of this in many cases, where like if you are selling something that just doesn't do what you purport that it does.
We can all think of headlines.
And then generally speaking, if you closer your product is to like actual like health and human life or whatever, like probably be more careful.
Maybe.
That's very great.
Make sure it's.
Yeah, but if you have a software product and like you're worried about taking someone's money without delivering on the promise, make sure you can pay them back, of course. But I also think that, you know, trying to define those lines for yourself is important. One case study would be what we're doing right now, which is a transition from an agency services consulting business to a productized model that can scale. And so like if I go to market and I say, I can build an outbound machine for you, that is true. We have a team to do that. The degree to which my product can do that is changing every day. But ultimately, we're at a place where like nobody's going to see the difference from the other side anyway. And then the question is like, what is our value proposition? Is our value proposition we're going to solve your growth challenge, or is it we're going to send emails? Because those are very, very different things.
Yeah. And I think that's the important part, right? There needs to be a degree of honesty and integrity about what your product can and can't do. And to your point, way back earlier, the point at which your product is ready in some fashion to be sold is that it solves a problem. It doesn't have to solve every problem you ever want it to. Right. And ideally, it solves a problem that's slightly differentiated in the market, regardless of whether it has all the features and things that you want it to. But like, particularly if it's going to be able to do something that is a little bit different, you know, because you'll have a harder time. Like if your product does the exact same thing as a million other companies in the exact same way, but just smaller and a little earlier stage, you might like that might be challenging.
Maybe, yeah. It's
said about pricing, you know, and if it's considerably cheaper than the alternatives, you might still have success. But particularly if it's doing something that's differentiated from the others on the market, like, you know, that can go a long ways towards giving you the ability and the credibility to market.
Something else that comes up here is like, I will say in most cases, I'm trying to check if this is true, like, know if you're using your marketing to determine if there is a problem or to determine if your solution solves the problem. Because I think both of those can be helpful. Like, I think that focus groups, pilots, warm intros, friends and family is a good way to do interviews and to understand like, what is it that is a challenge for you and how do you define that challenge? And then, of course, there's a little bit of mapping on like what they think the challenge is versus what it actually is, which is almost never the same. And that I think is like discovery mode, very early stage stuff. I think when you have that nailed down, honestly, that's probably a point. If you have an idea of how to solve that problem, that's a fair point to begin marketing in some way. So, and if you have effectively, you're pivoting with integrity around a problem, that's a really interesting thing to do. I think if you're changing problems that you're solving, that happens and you can do it. But I think there's probably more value in the qualitative discussion type data if you're trying to determine what the problem to be solved actually is versus is the thing that we've put together a good solution to this problem.
Yeah, I think that point's well taken because, I mean, you know, as well as I, that we've worked with companies before, right, that have hired us to help market a product that isn't for sale yet. You know, like there are ways that like marketing can be used even pre-sale where you can invest in, maybe it's not growth directly, but you can invest in marketing to build a better product over time, regardless of whether or not it's ready right now.
And there are challenges, I think, all along the way with this where maybe that's another piece, is like, one way to think about this is, what is your alternative set? So like if you're in a position where, and actually the term go to market is an interesting one when you think about it, because it's sort of like motion and sort of how do we actually get to this place, where with a larger company, it's sort of implied that you know where the market is and you don't have to go there, or you are at the market already. But I think in terms of go to market, thinking through what else could you possibly do with your time is probably the right way to think about it. And that's a different way to say that, is that I don't necessarily suggest that like doing a bunch of outbound at a really early stage is even a very good idea. I just think it's the best of a bunch of really bad ideas, because what else you could do is you could buy some Google ads, or you could keep talking to your friends, or you could keep tinkering with features. But of all these bad things, which in effect don't work that well, it's the one that's going to teach you the most quickly and the most cheaply, in order to try to figure out what direction to go. And so that, that's an interesting discussion to have, because I very frequently have conversations with founders in which I'm talking about different services that we might provide. And the question is always phrased as like, is this going to work? Right. And I don't know. I have no idea, but I have no reason to believe that it's less likely to work than other things. And I have a lot of reason to believe that it's going to be quicker or cheaper or clearer maybe on the marketing, which is useful.
Well, and that goes back to the general idea, right? That like, it's a lot easier to do in theory. It's a lot harder to do in practice when you're looking at the options and you're like, none of this is clear cut. None of this is great as far as like which avenue to take. But given the options, like, inaction is a choice. Like, not to get cheesy, but like it is. And sometimes, maybe I wouldn't say sometimes inaction is like the right thing, but sometimes, waiting to take something a little bit public or something can be a good thing, but a lot of times it's not. And, delaying that can be, detrimental in the long run.
The other reason for that too is that the whole discussion that we've had is really sort of focused on like the top of the funnel, and like, is there a way to get this new offering into the market in a way that people are engaging with? But you're going to have like a lot of attrition at several other stages throughout the funnel, right? And I think like if so really the longer you wait to get started, that kind of compounds, right? So if you wait an extra day to start doing your top of funnel stuff, by the time you get to the bottom of the funnel, you've probably added another week or week and a half to your first close, right? So there's like a little bit of like a bullwhip effect with that, which is interesting, because you're going to have resistance at the meeting, at the second meeting, at the close, at the pricing. All of this kind of stuff is going to happen. And so I do think that's often underestimated. When I get an email back from someone, which happens all the time, like, hey, could come back in a couple of weeks. I'm like, you probably just pushed back your first close by a quarter. Just by like waiting to do that. A couple of weeks is an incredibly long time at the top of the funnel, because it compounds.
Right. Well, and I'm not the salesperson, so I'm curious for your perspective on this. But as you're talking, it's making me wonder, like, is it easier in the future to potentially re-engage someone who fell off at some point in the funnel, potentially because they were like, hey, your product isn't where I need it right now, but they were interested enough to take a meeting with you at some point? Is it easier, assuming that you received that feedback and you build something in the future, is it easier to re-engage someone who fell off during that sales process?
If you're not a jerk and like you don't suck, generally speaking, like if you're the kind of person who can start a company and get other people to work for you and potentially even raise some money, odds are you're probably going to leave a good impression on someone new that you meet in the space. So like, bank the impression, I think, ultimately. And like, we get referrals from those people a lot, where they might have not bought something, or they tried it and it didn't work at all for them, but they liked the way that we did it. And I think that's actually very reasonable. I think that's very credible, because there are a lot of reasons something might not work for someone, and most of them have nothing to do with your product. So, so I do think, the kernel of your question, I think, is like, is there value in trying to move into the market, to go to market, regardless? And I would say, generally speaking, yes, unless you suck. So don't suck. But like, I think you probably don't. So that's kind of what I think.
Well, a lot of this has been very like, theoretical and stuff, but I think people would probably find it interesting and helpful maybe to walk through some of the real world scenarios. As you've mentioned, Incendium has gone through quite a shift over the past year, moving away from like an agency model into more of a productized marketing outbound engine, as well as some other services. So talk more kind of about like, the process of building our MVP for our product, and how you knew, when you knew it was ready to get out there.
I think like many other instances, we had some changes in the market that necessitated us to do something. We could not really stay put, which makes it easier to move, I think, because you have to. So you do, and you figure out ways to do it. I think that when you have a human capital centric consulting model, which is usually an easier place to start because you have knowledge as a founder, and that's valuable knowledge, whereas you might not have been able to systematize that in a product. When you have that human capital centric model, the number of, let's say, features or the number of sort of problems that you're solving is probably bundled or diverse. And one of the reasons that people probably hire you is because, well, I should put that differently. Different customers will hire you for different things, even though they're hiring the same person or the same company. They have different needs. And so you change what you're doing for each of them. So I think that step one is really about unbundling or disaggregating the things that you do. And so we needed to understand our company and the value that we provided and disaggregate it in a way. And so one example of how we could think about this is in terms of a sales funnel. So as we operate, like there's a lot of work that we do at the top of the funnel, which is very functional, very activity metrics driven around like sending out outbound. Great. There's value in that. There's actually even higher, I should be honest, just higher than that, like setting up an outbound infrastructure. There are companies that just do that. And like that is a business. But what we were doing is we were taking the sending the outbound, we were taking some work to get those outbounds to meetings. And in some cases, we were even helping beyond the meeting to get things closed. And like that was a whole flexible amalgam of different things that we could do. And the decisions we had to make were like, which of these things do we think we can more reliably deliver in a way that adds value? And so it's all a very long explanation to say that when you go through this process, I think, which everybody sort of goes through of like, I'm here to help versus this is a product I'm selling, you're probably reducing first. And I think most people think about adding feature set. That probably happens eventually, but generally speaking, I think you're reducing the number of problems that you're solving, similar to what I mentioned earlier. We needed to define the problem, and we're still in progress of doing this. It's going to take quite a long time. But for us, it made more sense to focus on things that we know we can do reliably, independent of the customer and independent of the market. And so a lot of that had to do with using outbound in a way that generated signals for demand. That was interesting for us. So that's really where we focus. Now that we've done that, it's really interesting because like you kind of boil it down to something where you send emails, you track opens, you track clicks. Like that's nice. Now we're thinking about different ways to connect the dots or like Lego brick, other things that a customer might want to do with those leads, effectively with those MQLs, to other parts of the system. And the challenge is like, how far do we want to go with that? How much of it is our product versus an integration? How much of it is connected to something that somebody else might be doing? And those are decisions that I don't have any real overarching heuristics for, as much as I have different ways that we think about it. And I think we're making each decision in a distinct and differentiated manner by seeing what people will pay for. But the first step is cutting away the things that either you don't want to be doing or they actually don't care about, and trying to see where that middle of the Venn diagram is if it's something that you can do really reliably well on a consistent basis.
Yeah. For us, how long did you wait before you started taking it to market?
So actually, I think the way to answer this question is that we went to market as two smart individuals first. So we didn't wait at all. We just showed up and started talking to people. And I think it took, this is maybe the best way to answer that question. From the point where we first went to market, that's like 8 or 9 years ago. And the offering kind of evolved from there. I do think that we are still in the same problem set, though, to the point that I made earlier, where growth for very early stage companies is a problem. It's a big one with a lot of different pieces to it. And as you can see from the description I just mentioned, like we kind of had done a lot of those different things. So I think that we really were in market right away because we were a services company. However, I do want to really highlight that I actually don't think that's very different than how software companies should operate, right? I think like if you've identified a problem and you've built something around it, like you should be a services company first, at least to some extent. And if you can build product to automate some of the things that you're doing, great, it'll make you faster. But in this day and age, it's so easy to do that you don't. I would argue that like as you're building, you can kind of be in market solving problems. So that's a little bit of a distinction, and maybe that drives some of my thinking on this is like if you if you know your market well enough to build a tool that solves the problem, you yourself can be that product. And you can't do that for everybody, but if you all of a sudden have 15 companies that are like, I would love to hire you to do this, like, that's what your product should do. Like that's what it is, as opposed to saying, all right, I'm working on building this thing. I think there's a little interplay. There's back and forth. There's points where like you need to go build a little bit more or whatever. And that definitely happens, especially in the early days. But I would bet, and maybe another way to put it is, if you can't yourself solve the problem as a human, you might not be the best person to build the product that solves the problem, at least at the early stage. So that's maybe a good heuristic is, will somebody just pay you to do this for them? And if not, like maybe figure something else out first. So, and you could do an outbound campaign around that. You could. I don't know many people who do, but I actually think that would be a reasonable investment, is to say like, hey, I'm Nate and I do outbound. I could see if there's market and demand there in some sort of marketing fashion.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we've touched on a lot of different things. Any parting thoughts? I feel like we've covered a wide smorgasbord of.
Yeah, I guess, the main thing is just, I want to make it clear, at least from our perspective, a lot of empathy around this idea of like, I'm not ready. But at the same time, I think thinking about it in terms of opportunity costs, like the alternative is that's the way that I would recommend people consider this. Like, what else are you going to do? And maybe the final thing I would say is that you're probably wrong about your thesis right now in some way. And that's okay. It will change. And getting comfortable with the idea of kind of reiterating with tremendous endurance and like doing it again and again and again. It's exhausting for a founder. It's exhausting for their team. But I think that's where you end up finding things, right? So that needs to be, you kind of just need to hang in until something serendipitously works. And the best way to start to do that is to be in market and to be embarrassed a little bit. It's very true.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Great to have you. You'll be back in future months. Just to predict into the future, we'll be talking through some other common objections that we hear most frequently that we think we can speak to a little bit, since they're objections that our team has had to face in our own way and kind of overcome. So thanks for joining us. And for anyone who is tuning in live or just in general, we're here every Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern for the Growth Accelerator. So tune in again. In the future, we'll have a variety of different experts coming on to talk about all sorts of B2B growth challenges and opportunities. All right. Thanks, Nate.
Marina. Appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Bye.